Welcome, history enthusiasts, to an epic journey through the entire sweep of American history. From its ancient origins to the complexities of the modern era, we'll explore the forces, conflicts, and triumphs that forged one of the most influential nations on Earth. This isn't just a collection of dates and names, it's a story of ambition, struggle, innovation, and the continuous redefinition of what it means to be American. So, settle in, because over the next 4 hours, we're going to uncover the remarkable, often tumultuous, and always compelling saga of the United States of America. Part 1. The Foundations, from Ancient Lands to Colonial Shores. Our story begins not with European ships, but millennia before, in a land teeming with diverse cultures. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples thrived across the North American continent. From the sophisticated agricultural societies of the Mississippian mound builders to the nomadic hunters of the Great Plains, the Pueblo cliff dwellers of the Southwest, and the intricate tribal networks of the eastern woodlands, these were vibrant civilizations with rich spiritual traditions, complex social structures, and deep connections to the land. They built cities, developed advanced farming techniques, and established vast trade networks, shaping the landscape and its ecosystems long before any Europeans set foot on its shores. Then came the seismic shift of European exploration. Driven by a thirst for wealth, new trade routes, and religious fervor, explorers like Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Americas in the late 15th century. Spain, an early dominant power, quickly established vast colonial empires in Central and South America, extracting immense riches and imposing its culture and religion, often brutally, upon indigenous populations. But our focus shifts north, to the nascent efforts of other European powers. The French ventured into what is now Canada and the Mississippi River Valley, primarily engaged in fur trading and establishing more cooperative, though still transformative, relationships with Native American tribes. The Dutch, too, briefly carved out a lucrative trading post in New Netherland, centered around what would become New York City. However, it was the English who would ultimately lay the most significant groundwork for the future United States. Their motivations were diverse: economic opportunity, religious freedom, and geopolitical competition with Spain and France. Jamestown, 1607, the first permanent English settlement in North America, was a brutal struggle for survival. Driven by the Virginia Company's desire for gold and a passage to Asia, the early colonists faced disease, starvation, and hostile relations with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. Only the leadership of John Smith and the introduction of tobacco as a cash crop by John Rolfe saved the colony from utter collapse. Tobacco, however, brought with it an insatiable demand for land and labor, setting the stage for conflict and the tragic introduction of African slavery in 1619. Plymouth, 1620, a very different story unfolded further north. The Pilgrims, separatist Puritans fleeing religious persecution in England, sought not wealth but a place to worship freely. Their journey on the Mayflower and the signing of the Mayflower Compact, an early agreement for self-governance, laid a foundation for democratic ideals. Despite a harsh first winter, they survived with the aid of Squanto and the Wampanoag people, establishing a community rooted in religious devotion and communal living. The English colonial project expanded rapidly throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, creating 13 distinct colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. Each region developed its own character. New England, dominated by Puritan values, emphasizing community, education, Harvard was founded in 1636, and strict moral codes. Its economy was based on small farms, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. Town meetings fostered a strong tradition of local self-governance. Middle colonies, a melting pot of cultures and religions, including Quakers in Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn as a haven for religious tolerance, Dutch, Germans, and Scots-Irish. These colonies boasted fertile lands for grain production and thriving port cities like Philadelphia and New York, fostering a more diverse and commercially oriented society. Southern colonies, characterized by large-scale plantation agriculture, primarily tobacco, rice, and indigo. This system relied heavily on enslaved African labor, leading to a rigid social hierarchy with wealthy planters at the top. The Anglican Church was dominant, and political power was concentrated in the hands of a few elite families. Throughout the colonial period, interactions with Native Americans were complex and often violent. As European settlements expanded, land disputes escalated into devastating conflicts like King Philip's War in New England and the Anglo-Powhatan Wars in Virginia. Disease, introduced by Europeans, decimated indigenous populations, further weakening their ability to resist encroachment. Economically, the colonies operated under the British system of mercantilism, where they existed to benefit the mother country by providing raw materials and serving as a market for finished goods. Navigation Acts regulated colonial trade, ensuring it passed through British hands. Despite these restrictions, the colonies developed a robust internal economy and a growing sense of self-sufficiency. Socially, the colonies were diverse but also stratified. While opportunities for land ownership and social mobility were greater than in Europe, rigid class structures existed, and the institution of slavery became deeply entrenched, particularly in the South, creating a brutal system of forced labor and racial oppression that would haunt the nation for centuries. The 18th century saw a period of spiritual revival known as the Great Awakening. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield ignited a fervent religious movement that emphasized personal conversion and challenged established religious authority. This movement had profound social and political implications, fostering a sense of shared identity among colonists and encouraging a questioning of traditional hierarchies, laying some of the intellectual groundwork for revolutionary thought. By the mid-18th century, the colonies were growing in population, wealth, and confidence. They were increasingly aware of their distinct identity, separate from that of Britain. Yet, they remained subjects of the British Crown, a relationship that was about to be tested by a series of events that would ignite a revolution. Part 2: Revolution, Republic, and Early Growing Pains. The mid-18th century brought a new global conflict that would fundamentally alter the relationship between Britain and its American colonies, the French and Indian War, 1754–1763, known globally as the 7 Years' War. This conflict, fought between Britain and France, and their respective Native American allies, for control of North America, resulted in a decisive British victory. France lost nearly all its North American territories, and Britain emerged as the dominant power. However, victory came at a steep price. The war left Britain with a massive debt. To recoup these costs and to better administer its vast new empire, Parliament began to implement a series of policies that would infuriate the colonists. Proclamation of 1763 forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, intended to prevent further conflict with Native Americans but seen by colonists as an infringement on their expansion. Sugar Act, 1764 aimed at curbing smuggling and raising revenue, it lowered the tax on molasses but strictly enforced its collection. Stamp Act, 1765 This was the real flashpoint. It required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for all legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards. Unlike previous taxes, this was a direct tax on the colonists, not a regulation of trade. The cry of "no taxation without representation" echoed through the colonies. Colonists argued that only their own colonial assemblies, not the distant British Parliament, had the right to tax them. Protests, boycotts, and the formation of groups like the Sons of Liberty forced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, but they simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The cycle of taxation and protest continued. The Townshend Acts, 1767, imposed duties on imported goods like glass, lead, paper, and tea. These acts were met with renewed boycotts and resistance, leading to the Boston Massacre, 1770, where British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters, killing 5. While most of the Townshend duties were repealed, the tax on tea remained, a symbolic assertion of British authority. The Tea Act, 1773, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, was perceived as another attempt to trick colonists into accepting parliamentary taxation. In response, a group of Bostonians, disguised as Native Americans, staged the Boston Tea Party, dumping 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Britain's retaliation was swift and severe. The Intolerable Acts, 1774, also known as the Coercive Acts, closed Boston Harbor, placed Massachusetts under martial law, and expanded the Quartering Act, allowing British troops to be housed in private homes. These punitive measures united the colonies in defiance. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia was absent, debated grievances, called for a boycott of British goods, and asserted colonial rights. They agreed to meet again if their demands were not met. The breaking point came in April 1775, with the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord. British troops, attempting to seize colonial arms and arrest Patriot leaders, clashed with colonial militias, marking the beginning of armed conflict. The Second Continental Congress met in May 1775, now faced with open warfare. Despite a final plea for peace in the Olive Branch Petition, King George III declared the colonies in rebellion. The Congress began to organize a Continental Army, appointing George Washington as its commander. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals of liberty, natural rights, and self-governance, and fueled by Thomas Paine's influential pamphlet Common Sense, the sentiment for independence grew. On July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson. This monumental document articulated the philosophical basis for revolution, listing grievances against the king and declaring the colonies to be free and independent states. The Revolutionary War, 1775–1783, was a grueling struggle against the most powerful military in the world. The Continental Army, often ill-equipped and poorly trained, faced numerous defeats early on. Key moments included Battle of Trenton, 1776. Washington's surprise attack on Hessian mercenaries boosted morale. Battle of Saratoga, 1777. A decisive American victory that convinced France to formally ally with the United States, providing crucial military and financial aid. Valley Forge, 1777–78. A brutal winter encampment where the Continental Army endured immense suffering but emerged stronger and more disciplined under Baron von Steuben. Battle of Yorktown, 1781. A combined American and French siege that forced the surrender of General Cornwallis's British Army, effectively ending major hostilities. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, formally recognized American independence and established the boundaries of the new nation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. With independence secured, the challenge was to build a new nation. The first attempt at a national government was the Articles of Confederation, 1781–1789. While it successfully guided the nation through the end of the war and established a system for admitting new states, the Northwest Ordinance, it proved too weak to address the country's growing problems. The central government lacked the power to tax, regulate interstate commerce, or enforce laws, leading to economic instability, interstate disputes, and events like Shays' Rebellion, which highlighted the need for a stronger federal system. Recognizing these deficiencies, delegates convened in Philadelphia in 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. After months of intense debate and compromise, they drafted the United States Constitution. This revolutionary document established a federal system with a strong central government, divided into three branches: the legislative, Congress, executive, President, and judicial, Supreme Court, with a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. Key compromises included the Great Compromise, creating a bicameral legislature with proportional representation in the House and equal representation in the Senate, and the Three-Fifths Compromise, counting enslaved persons as three-fifths of a person for representation and taxation. The Constitution's ratification was not a foregone conclusion. Federalists, like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, argued for its adoption in the Federalist Papers, emphasizing the need for a strong national government. Anti-federalists, concerned about the potential for tyranny and the lack of individual rights protections, opposed it. To secure ratification, the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791, guaranteeing fundamental freedoms like speech, religion, and assembly. George Washington was unanimously elected the first president in 1789. His presidency laid crucial precedents. He established the cabinet, oversaw the creation of the National Bank, a key policy of his Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, and navigated early foreign policy challenges, including maintaining neutrality in the wars between Britain and France. His farewell address warned against political factions and entangling foreign alliances. The early republic saw the emergence of the first political parties. the Federalists, led by Hamilton, who favored a strong central government, industrial development, and a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who advocated for states' rights, agrarianism, and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. John Adams's presidency, 1797 to 1801, was marked by tensions with France, including the XYZ affair and the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, which restricted immigration and free speech, leading to a backlash, and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Thomas Jefferson's presidency, 1801 to 1809, ushered in a new era. His most significant achievement was the Louisiana Purchase, 1803, from France, doubling the size of the United States and opening vast new territories for westward expansion. He dispatched the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore this new frontier, charting the landscape and encountering numerous Native American tribes. The purchase, however, raised constitutional questions about presidential power. The young nation was still finding its footing, grappling with its identity, the balance of power, and the immense challenges of westward expansion and international relations. The seeds of future conflicts, particularly over slavery and states' rights, were already being sown. Part 3: Expansion, Sectionalism, and the Brink of War. The early 19th century was a period of rapid growth and defining conflicts for the United States. Tensions with Britain, stemming from impressment of American sailors and British support for Native American resistance in the West, culminated in the War of 1812. Though often called the Second War of Independence, it ended in a stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent. However, it fostered a stronger sense of national identity, boosted American manufacturing, and saw the decline of the Federalist Party. The Battle of New Orleans, fought after the peace treaty was signed, made Andrew Jackson a national hero. Following the war, the nation entered the era of good feelings, a period of relative political unity under President James Monroe. This era saw the articulation of the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, declaring the Western Hemisphere off-limits to further European colonization and intervention, asserting American influence in the region. The 1820s and 1830s witnessed the rise of Jacksonian democracy, a movement that championed the common man and expanded suffrage to most white men, regardless of property ownership. Andrew Jackson, a populist figure, served as president from 1829 to 1837. His presidency was marked by the nullification crisis. South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, threatened to nullify federal tariffs, claiming states' rights to reject federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Jackson, despite being a states' rights advocate, firmly asserted federal authority, ultimately defusing the crisis. The Bank War. Jackson vehemently opposed the Second Bank of the United States, viewing it as an elitist institution. He vetoed its recharter, leading to its demise and contributing to economic instability. Indian removal. Perhaps the darkest chapter of Jackson's presidency was his policy of forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the tragic Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole people were forcibly marched westward, resulting in immense suffering and death. The concept of manifest destiny captivated the American imagination in the mid-19th century. This belief held that the United States was divinely ordained to expand westward across the North American continent, spreading democracy and civilization. This ideology fueled aggressive territorial expansion. Texas Revolution, 1835 to 1836. American settlers in Mexican Texas rebelled, leading to independence and eventually the annexation of Texas by the U.S. in 1845. Oregon Territory. The U.S. and Britain peacefully resolved their dispute over the Oregon Territory, dividing it at the 49th parallel in 1846. Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. President James K. Polk, a fervent believer in manifest destiny, provoked a war with Mexico. The U.S. decisively won, acquiring vast territories in the Mexican Cession, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This enormous land acquisition reignited the contentious debate over the expansion of slavery. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 triggered the California Gold Rush, drawing hundreds of thousands of people westward in search of fortune, rapidly accelerating the development of the West. Meanwhile, the economic and social landscapes of the North and South were diverging dramatically. The Industrial Revolution transformed the North into a hub of manufacturing, commerce, and finance. Factories, powered by water and later steam, produced textiles, machinery, and other goods. Cities grew rapidly, fueled by waves of immigration from Ireland and Germany. This industrial economy fostered a diverse workforce, though often with harsh working conditions. In the South, the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 had a profound and tragic impact. It made cotton cultivation immensely profitable, leading to the expansion of the Cotton Kingdom across the Deep South. This economic boom was entirely dependent on the brutal institution of chattel slavery. Enslaved Africans were not merely laborious, they were considered property, subjected to unimaginable cruelty, forced separation from families, and denied basic human rights. The South developed a hierarchical society based on race and land ownership, with a small planter elite dominating politics and culture. The moral abomination of slavery increasingly became the central issue dividing the nation. The abolitionist movement gained momentum, with powerful voices like Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man who became a brilliant orator and writer, Harriet Tubman, a conductor on the Underground Railroad who risked her life to free hundreds, and William Lloyd Garrison, a white editor of The Liberator, advocating for immediate emancipation. As the nation expanded, the question of whether new territories would be slave or free states became a constant source of political tension, leading to a series of fragile compromises. Missouri Compromise, 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, maintaining the balance in the Senate, and prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Purchase territory north of 36° 30' latitude. Compromise of 1850, a complex package of laws that admitted California as a free state, abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., allowed popular sovereignty, the right of residents to decide, in New Mexico and Utah territories, and enacted a stricter Fugitive Slave Act, which infuriated Northerners. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854 proposed by Stephen Douglas, it repealed the Missouri Compromise and applied popular sovereignty to the Kansas and Nebraska territories. This led to Bleeding Kansas, a period of violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. The Dred Scott v. Sanford Supreme Court decision, 1857, further inflamed tensions. The court ruled that enslaved or formerly enslaved African Americans were not citizens and had no standing to sue in federal court, and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. This decision effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise and thrilled Southerners while enraging Northerners. The growing divide was evident in the rise of new political parties, notably the Republican Party, founded in the 1850s on an anti-slavery platform. Events like John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, an attempt to spark a slave rebellion, further polarized the nation, pushing it closer to the precipice of civil war. The stage was set for the ultimate test of the American experiment. Part 4. The Civil War and Reconstruction. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a Republican committed to preventing the expansion of slavery, was the final straw for many Southern states. Though Lincoln had no intention of abolishing slavery where it already existed, his election was seen as a direct threat to the Southern way of life and its economic system. Beginning with South Carolina in December 1860, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America in February 1861, with Jefferson Davis as their president. They asserted their right to self-determination and the preservation of slavery. The Civil War, 1861–1865, officially began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a brutal and devastating conflict, pitting brother against brother, and testing the very idea of a unified United States. The Union, North, had significant advantages in population, industrial capacity, and a developed railroad network. The Confederacy, South, had the advantage of fighting on its home soil, a strong military tradition, and initially, superior military leadership. Key figures and moments of the war include Union leaders, President Abraham Lincoln, His leadership, determination, and eloquence were crucial. Ulysses S. Grant, Union general who adopted a strategy of attrition and relentless pursuit. William Tecumseh Sherman, known for his march to the sea. Confederate leaders: Jefferson Davis, President; Robert E. Lee, brilliant Confederate general; Stonewall Jackson. Major battles. First Battle of Bull Run, 1861 showed both sides that the war would not be short. Antietam, 1862, the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. A Union victory that gave Lincoln the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Gettysburg, 1863, a turning point in the East, where the Union decisively repelled Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania. Vicksburg, 1863, a Union siege that gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy. Sherman's March to the Sea, 1864, a destructive campaign through Georgia that crippled the South's infrastructure and morale. Lincoln's war aims evolved. Initially, the war was fought to preserve the Union. However, as the conflict progressed, the moral imperative of ending slavery became central. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. While it didn't immediately free anyone in Union-controlled areas or border states, it transformed the war into a moral crusade against slavery, encouraged enslaved people to escape and join the Union cause, and discouraged European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. The war's impact was immense. Over 620,000 soldiers died, more than in all other American wars combined. The South was devastated, its economy shattered, and its social structure upended. The Union was preserved, and the fundamental question of states' rights versus federal authority was settled in favor of the latter. Just days after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, President Lincoln was tragically assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. His death cast a long shadow over the challenging period that followed. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, was the era dedicated to rebuilding the South, integrating formerly enslaved people into society, and determining the terms of readmission for the Confederate States. It was a period of immense hope and crushing disappointment. Presidential Reconstruction, 1865 to 1866, led by Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, it was lenient towards the South, allowing former Confederates to regain power and enacting black codes that severely restricted the rights of African Americans, essentially re-establishing a system of forced labor. Radical Reconstruction, 1867 to 1877 Congress, dominated by radical Republicans who sought to punish the South and protect black rights, took control. They passed the Reconstruction Acts, dividing the South into military districts and requiring states to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant black men suffrage before readmission. The Reconstruction Amendments were monumental. 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., including formerly enslaved people, and guaranteed equal protection of the laws and due process. 15th Amendment, 1870, prohibited states from denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. During Radical Reconstruction, African Americans gained political power for the first time, with many serving in state legislatures and even Congress. The Freedmen's Bureau provided aid, education, and legal assistance to formerly enslaved people. However, this progress was met with fierce resistance from white Southerners. Paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using violence, intimidation, and terror to suppress black voting and reassert white supremacy. The North's commitment to Reconstruction waned over time. Economic depressions, political scandals, and a desire for sectional reconciliation contributed to its decline. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election of 1876, led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. With the end of federal oversight, white Southerners rapidly re-established control. Through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence, they systematically disenfranchised African Americans. The era of Jim Crow laws began, enforcing racial segregation in all aspects of public life and cementing a system of racial oppression that would last for nearly a century. The promise of equality enshrined in the Reconstruction Amendments remained largely unfulfilled for generations. Part 5. The Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the United States entered a period of unprecedented economic growth and social change known as the Gilded Age, roughly 1870s-1900. Coined by Mark Twain, the term suggested a glittering surface masking underlying poverty, corruption, and inequality. This era was defined by rapid industrialization. New technologies, abundant natural resources, a growing labor supply, fueled by immigration, and pro-business government policies created an environment ripe for massive economic expansion. Key industries like steel, oil, railroads, and finance exploded. Titans of industry, figures like Andrew Carnegie, steel, John D. Rockefeller, oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroads, and J.P. Morgan, finance, amassed colossal fortunes, often through ruthless business practices like monopolies, trusts, and vertical-horizontal integration. They were lauded as captains of industry for their innovation and wealth creation, but also condemned as robber barons for their exploitation of labor and anti-competitive practices. Labor and conflict. The rapid industrialization led to the rise of a large industrial working class, often living in poverty and working in dangerous conditions for low wages. This spurred the growth of labor unions like the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, AFL. Major strikes, often met with violence from company-hired thugs or state militias, became common. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair, 1886, and the Pullman Strike, 1894, highlighted the intense class conflict of the era. Immigration and urbanization. Millions of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as Asia, poured into American cities seeking economic opportunity. This led to rapid urbanization, with cities growing exponentially but often struggling with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and crime. Immigrants often faced discrimination and lived in ethnic enclaves. Political corruption. The Gilded Age was notorious for political corruption. Machine politics, exemplified by Tammany Hall in New York City, used patronage and graft to control city governments. Scandals plagued the federal government, and powerful business interests often influenced legislation through lobbying and bribery. The populist movement, farmers, struggling with falling crop prices, high railroad rates, and crushing debt, formed the Populist Party in the 1890s. They advocated for reforms like the coinage of silver, to increase the money supply, government regulation of railroads, and direct election of senators. While the party ultimately failed to win the presidency, many of its ideas were later adopted by the progressive movement. The excesses and inequalities of the Gilded Age gave rise to the Progressive Era, roughly 1890s to 1920s, a widespread reform movement aimed at addressing the social, economic, and political problems created by industrialization and urbanization. Progressives were a diverse group, middle-class reformers, journalists, academics, and politicians who believed in the power of government to improve society. Key aspects and achievements of the Progressive Era. Muckrakers, investigative journalists like Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, exposing the meatpacking industry, Ida Tarbell, exposing Standard Oil, and Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, documenting urban poverty, exposed corruption and social ills, galvanizing public opinion for reform. Social reforms. Efforts were made to improve living conditions, combat child labor, and regulate working hours. The settlement house movement, led by Jane Addams, provided social services to urban poor and immigrants. Political reforms. Progressives pushed for greater democracy and accountability, including direct primary, allowing voters, not party bosses, to choose candidates. Initiative, referendum, and recall, giving citizens more direct power over legislation and elected officials. 17th Amendment, 1913 direct election of U.S. Senators, previously chosen by state legislatures. Trust busting and regulation. Presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, earned a reputation as a trust buster, using the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies. He also championed conservation, establishing national parks and forests. His successor, William Howard Taft, continued trust-busting. Consumer protection. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, 1906, were passed in response to muckraker exposés, establishing federal regulation of food and medicine. Women's suffrage. The long struggle for women's right to vote culminated in the 19th Amendment, 1920, granting women nationwide suffrage. Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 1921, a progressive Democrat, Wilson pursued his new freedom agenda, which included the Federal Reserve Act, creating the central banking system, the Clayton Antitrust Act, strengthening anti-monopoly laws, and the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. The progressive era fundamentally reshaped the role of government in American society, moving it towards greater regulation of business, protection of consumers, and expansion of democratic participation. While it had its limitations, often overlooking racial inequality and promoting some nativist policies, it laid the groundwork for future social and economic reforms. The nation was becoming a global industrial power, but its internal struggles for justice and equality were far from over. Part 6. World Wars, Roaring Twenties, and the Great Depression. The early 20th century plunged the United States into global conflicts and profound domestic transformations. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the United States initially maintained a policy of neutrality and isolationism, reflecting a long-standing tradition of avoiding European entanglements. However, German unrestricted submarine warfare, especially the sinking of the Lusitania, and the Zimmermann telegram, proposing a German-Mexican alliance, ultimately pushed the U.S. into the war. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson declared war, famously stating the goal was to make the world safe for democracy. American intervention, though relatively short, 1917 to 1918, was decisive. The influx of fresh American troops and resources helped turn the tide on the Western Front. On the home front, the war led to unprecedented government intervention in the economy, rationing, and a surge in patriotism, but also suppression of dissent and anti-immigrant sentiment. After the Allied victory, President Wilson played a leading role in the Paris Peace Conference, advocating for his 14 points, a plan for lasting peace that included the creation of a League of Nations. However, despite Wilson's efforts, the U.S. Senate, wary of foreign entanglements and loss of sovereignty, refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and never joined the League of Nations, marking a return to isolationist tendencies. The immediate aftermath of World War I ushered in the Roaring Twenties, 1920s, a decade of unprecedented economic prosperity and dramatic social and cultural change. Economic boom, fueled by mass production, especially the automobile industry, pioneered by Henry Ford, new consumer goods, radios, appliances, easy credit, and a booming stock market, the 1920s saw a surge in consumerism and a rising standard of living for many. Social and cultural shifts. Jazz Age. A vibrant new musical genre emerged, reflecting the era's energy and challenging traditional norms. Flappers. Young women who challenged traditional gender roles, embracing shorter hemlines, bobbed hair, and more liberated lifestyles. Prohibition, 18th Amendment, 1920, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol, it led to the rise of speakeasies, organized crime, like Al Capone, and widespread disregard for the law. It was ultimately repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. Harlem Renaissance, a flourishing of African American art, literature, and music centered in Harlem, New York, celebrating Black culture and identity. Nativism and xenophobia. Despite the progressive veneer, the decade also saw a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and the Scopes monkey trial, reflecting a clash between traditional values and modern science. The party came to a crashing halt on October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, when the stock market collapsed, triggering the Great Depression. This was the most severe economic downturn in American history, lasting throughout the 1930s. Causes. A combination of factors contributed to the depression: overproduction in agriculture and industry, unequal distribution of wealth, excessive speculation in the stock market, widespread bank failures, and a global economic downturn. Impact. Millions lost their jobs, homes, and savings. Unemployment soared to 25%. Farmers faced foreclosures, and a severe drought in the Great Plains created the Dust Bowl, forcing thousands of Okies to migrate westward. People lived in Hoovervilles, shanty towns, and soup kitchens became common. President Herbert Hoover's response: Hoover, believing in limited government intervention and individual self-reliance, initially took a hands-off approach, relying on voluntary cooperation and limited federal aid. His policies were largely ineffective in stemming the crisis, leading to widespread public disillusionment. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, was elected president, promising a New Deal for the American people. His presidency, 1933 to 1945, fundamentally reshaped the role of the federal government. The New Deal was a series of ambitious programs and reforms designed to provide relief for the unemployed, promote recovery of the economy, and enact reform to prevent future depressions. Key New Deal programs included Relief, Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, Public Works Administration, PWA, Works Progress Administration, WPA, providing jobs on public projects. Recovery, Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, aimed at raising farm prices. National Recovery Administration, NRA, attempted to regulate industry. Reform. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC insured bank deposits, restoring public confidence in banks. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, regulated the stock market. Social Security Act, 1935, established a national system of old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to families with dependent children, creating a vital social safety net. The New Deal did not fully end the Great Depression, but it provided crucial relief, stabilized the financial system, and laid the foundation for the modern American welfare state. It significantly expanded the power and scope of the federal government. As the U.S. struggled with economic crisis, a new global threat emerged. The rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe, Nazi Germany under Hitler, Fascist Italy under Mussolini, and militaristic Japan in Asia led to increasing international tensions. The U.S. initially clung to isolationism, passing neutrality acts. However, as aggression escalated, invasion of Poland, fall of France, Battle of Britain, FDR began to move the nation towards intervention, providing aid to the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease. The turning point came on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan, formally entering World War II. The U.S. fought a two-front war, in the European theater against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and in the Pacific theater against Imperial Japan. European theater, American forces, led by generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower, played a crucial role in the D-Day invasion of Normandy, June 6, 1944, liberating France and pushing into Germany. The war in Europe ended with Germany's surrender in May 1945. Pacific Theater. The U.S. pursued an island-hopping strategy, gradually pushing back Japanese forces in brutal battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The home front. World War II transformed American society. Factories converted to wartime production, ending the Great Depression. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, Rosie the Riveter, and millions of men served in the armed forces. The war also saw the tragic internment of Japanese Americans. The war in the Pacific concluded dramatically in August 1945, when President Harry S. Truman, having succeeded FDR, who died in April, made the decision to drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to Japan's unconditional surrender. World War II solidified the United States' position as a global superpower, but it also ushered in a new era of geopolitical tension and ideological conflict. Part 7. The Cold War and Civil Rights. The end of World War II did not bring an era of peace but rather a new kind of global conflict, the Cold War, roughly 1947 to 1991. This was an ideological and geopolitical struggle between the United States and its Western allies, advocating democracy and capitalism, and the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies, advocating communism. It was cold because it rarely involved direct military confrontation between the two superpowers, but rather proxy wars, an arms race, espionage, and intense propaganda. Origins. The ideological differences, mutual suspicion, and disagreements over post-war Europe, especially the division of Germany and the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, creating an Iron Curtain, quickly led to confrontation. Containment. The cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy was containment, articulated by George F. Kennan, aiming to prevent the spread of communism. Truman Doctrine, 1947 pledged U.S. support to countries resisting communist influence, initially Greece and Turkey. Marshall Plan, 1948 provided massive economic aid to rebuild war-torn Western Europe, preventing communist takeovers and creating strong trading partners. Berlin Blockade, 1948–49 The Soviet Union blocked Western access to West Berlin. The US and Britain responded with the Berlin Airlift, successfully supplying the city. NATO, 1949 The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance formed by the US and Western European nations for collective defense against Soviet aggression. The Soviets responded with the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War quickly became a global struggle. The loss of China to communism in 1949 and the Soviet Union's development of an atomic bomb intensified fears. Korean War, 1950–1953 When Communist North Korea invaded South Korea, the US led a United Nations force to defend South Korea. The war ended in a stalemate, solidifying the division of the Korean peninsula. McCarthyism. In the early 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy led a paranoid anti-communist witch hunt, accusing many Americans of disloyalty and subversion, often without evidence, leading to blacklisting and ruined careers. The 1950s were also a period of economic prosperity and suburban growth in the US, but beneath the surface, profound social injustices persisted. The civil rights movement gained momentum, challenging racial segregation and discrimination that had been entrenched since the end of Reconstruction. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954 The Supreme Court declared state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine. This landmark decision ignited the movement. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955–56 Parks' refusal to give up her seat sparked a year-long boycott, led by a young Martin Luther King Jr., which successfully desegregated the city's buses and brought King to national prominence. Nonviolent protest. King advocated for nonviolent civil disobedience, drawing inspiration from Gandhi. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and peaceful marches became powerful tools of protest. Key legislation. Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, effectively ending Jim Crow segregation. Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests, significantly increasing African American voter registration and political participation. The 1960s were a turbulent decade, marked by both progress and profound division. The Cold War intensified with events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, where the US and Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear war over Soviet missiles in Cuba, ultimately resolved through tense negotiations. The Vietnam War became a defining and deeply divisive conflict. The US gradually escalated its involvement in Vietnam, initially to support South Vietnam against Communist North Vietnam, fearing a domino effect where communism would spread throughout Southeast Asia. Under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, US troop levels soared. Escalation and protest. The war became increasingly unpopular at home, leading to massive anti-war protests, especially on college campuses. The draft, high casualties, and the perceived futility of the war fueled widespread dissent. Impact. The war deeply polarized American society, eroded public trust in government, and resulted in over 58,000 American deaths. It ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. Alongside the civil rights movement, other social movements emerged: the women's liberation movement, environmentalism, and the gay rights movement, all challenging existing norms and demanding greater equality and justice. The decade ended with the Watergate scandal, 1972–1974, a political scandal involving a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters and subsequent cover-up by the Nixon administration. The scandal led to President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974, further eroding public trust in government and demonstrating the power of the press and the system of checks and balances. The Cold War continued, but the US was also grappling with its own internal divisions, economic challenges, stagflation, and a changing global landscape. Part 8. Late 20th Century to the Present, a New Millennium, approx 40 minutes. The late 20th century saw the United States navigate a complex world, marked by the end of the Cold War, technological revolutions, and new global challenges. The 1980s were largely defined by the presidency of Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989. Reagan ushered in an era of conservative resurgence, advocating for Reaganomics, supply-side economics, involving significant tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced government spending, though military spending increased dramatically. While it spurred economic growth, it also led to rising national debt and increased income inequality. Strong anti-communism, Reagan took a hard line against the Soviet Union, referring to it as an evil empire and pursuing a military buildup. His policies, combined with internal Soviet economic and political weaknesses, contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. The end of the Cold War came swiftly and unexpectedly. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the triumph of democracy and capitalism over communism, leaving the United States as the sole global superpower. The 1990s, under President Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001, were a period of economic prosperity, technological revolution, and relative peace. Globalization. The decade saw accelerating globalization, with increased international trade and interconnectedness. Internet revolution. The widespread adoption of the Internet began to fundamentally transform communication, commerce, and daily life, laying the groundwork for the digital age. NAFTA. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, eliminated trade barriers between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Impeachment. Clinton faced impeachment proceedings by the House of Representatives for perjury and obstruction of justice, though he was acquitted by the Senate. The dawn of the 21st century brought new challenges and a profound shift in national focus. On September 11, 2001, the United States was attacked by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. Coordinated hijackings of commercial airplanes resulted in the collapse of the World Trade Center towers in New York City, damage to the Pentagon, and a plane crash in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The 9/11 attacks fundamentally reshaped American foreign and domestic policy. President George W. Bush, 2001 to 2009, launched the War on Terror, declaring a global fight against terrorism. War in Afghanistan. 2001, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to dismantle Al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban regime that harbored them. Iraq War. 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, citing concerns about weapons of mass destruction and links to terrorism, overthrowing Saddam Hussein. The war proved highly controversial, costly, and led to a prolonged insurgency. Homeland Security. Domestically, the Department of Homeland Security was created, and the Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers in the name of national security. The mid-2000s also brought significant economic turmoil. The Great Recession, 2007 to 2009, triggered by a collapse in the housing market and a subprime mortgage crisis, led to widespread foreclosures, bank failures, and a severe economic downturn. The government responded with massive bailouts of financial institutions and an economic stimulus package. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected the first African American president, 2009 to 2017, a historic moment reflecting the nation's ongoing journey towards racial equality. His presidency focused on economic recovery, overseeing the recovery from the Great Recession. Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, a landmark healthcare reform law aimed at expanding health insurance coverage. End of Iraq War, withdrawing U.S. troops from Iraq. Killing of Osama bin Laden, 2011. The 2010s and beyond have been characterized by continued rapid technological advancement, increasing social and political polarization, and evolving global dynamics. Social and cultural shifts. Continued progress in LGBTQ+ rights, e.g., nationwide legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015, increased awareness of racial injustice, e.g., Black Lives Matter movement, and ongoing debates about immigration, gun control, and climate change. Political polarization. The political landscape has become increasingly divided, with sharp ideological differences between the two major parties and a rise in partisan media. Rise of social media. Social media platforms have transformed communication, information dissemination, and political discourse, but also contributed to the spread of misinformation and echo chambers. Global challenges. The U.S. continues to grapple with complex global challenges, including climate change, pandemics, e.g., COVID-19, cybersecurity threats, and the rise of new global powers. The presidency of Donald Trump, 2017 to 2021, challenged many political norms, focusing on an America First agenda, trade protectionism, and a more nationalistic approach to foreign policy. His administration saw significant tax cuts, deregulation, and appointments of conservative judges. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 brought unprecedented public health and economic crises, leading to widespread lockdowns, massive government spending, and a rapid development of vaccines. The current era, under President Joe Biden, 2021-present, faces the ongoing aftermath of the pandemic, economic inflation, renewed geopolitical tensions, e.g., Russia's war in Ukraine, and persistent domestic divisions. Conclusion: the ever-evolving American experiment. We have journeyed through centuries of American history, from its indigenous roots to the complexities of the 21st century. It's a story of profound contradictions, a nation founded on ideals of liberty and equality, yet built upon the brutal institution of slavery and the displacement of Native Americans. It's a tale of relentless expansion and innovation, but also of deep internal conflicts and struggles for justice. Throughout its history, the United States has been defined by a few recurring themes. The pursuit of liberty and democracy. From the Declaration of Independence to the Civil Rights Movement, the struggle to expand the promise of freedom and self-governance to all has been a continuous thread. Expansion and innovation. A relentless drive westward and an entrepreneurial spirit have fueled economic growth and technological advancement. Conflict and compromise. From the Revolution to the Civil War, and from labor disputes to culture wars, American history is replete with conflicts that have often been resolved, however imperfectly, through compromise. Immigration and diversity. Waves of immigrants have continually reshaped the nation's demographic, cultural, and economic landscape, making America a vibrant, if sometimes challenging, melting pot. The role of government. The debate over the proper role and size of government, from the early republic to the New Deal and beyond, has been a constant in American political life. The history of the United States is not a finished story. It is an ongoing experiment, continually being written by each generation. The challenges of today, from political polarization and economic inequality to climate change and global competition, are new manifestations of enduring American dilemmas. But just as the nation has overcome immense obstacles in the past, its future will be shaped by its ability to confront these challenges, adapt, and redefine its ideals for a new era. Thank you for joining us on this extensive historical journey. We hope this deep dive into the American past has provided you with a richer understanding of its present and a clearer perspective on its future.